So we have DJ Jordan on with us, and DJ Jordan has done a lot of work in the area that we're going to talk about. Candidate for the House of Delegates, and this was one of the issues that he ran on, and that I think we could really use his insight with respect to criminal justice reform. DJ, how are you doing, brother?
I'm doing all right, Nick. You're doing a great job on the show, man.
Oh, thank you. I'm doing my best. And I know you know what you're talking about. You've done a lot of stuff in broadcast and television media, and so I take the compliment from you even greater admiration and respect. So tell us a little bit. I mean, we've been having this conversation about, you and I have been talking about criminal justice reform for, years now, and what's the best approach and what's the best policy. And obviously, everything that happened with respect to George Floyd, and there's more information out now, and then you had the protest movement. And I think what you saw was a lot of people that agreed on certain fundamental changes, whether it was with sovereign immunity or whether it was with, more emphasis on community policing and less, federal consolidation and things like that. And then obviously it's gotten off into this direction now where it's almost like if you're pro-criminal justice reform, you're anti-cop, or if you're pro-cop, you're anti-criminal justice reform. And I know I've never seen it that way. I mean, I grew up in a law enforcement family, and I see criminal justice reform as being pro-justice, which is pro-victim, pro-police, and also providing some sort of mechanism for people to be able to pay their debt and re-enter society. I mean, what's your take on where we're at right now in this debate?
Well, first of all, I think it's notable that the Liberty Movement has been talking about criminal justice reform on the right before it was cool. Mm-hmm. And you had more people start to come to this position because really you're talking about, your government and the police and the Department of Justice and how it treats its citizens, how it enacts civil liberties and protects civil liberties. So I think, it's a good position to come from that point of view. Unfortunately, we are in a very tribalistic, partisan environment where people go to their extremes. They go to their side and say, oh, so you're for this police reform, you must want to, defund and abolish the police. And they go to their corner and they fight against the other people who say, police can do no wrong or whatever. We need to be far more thoughtful when it comes to how to actually keep the public safe. And, I put out a policy piece when I ran for delegate last year. And one of the first responsibilities of government is to protect its citizens. And I think the first objective of any type of criminal justice reform or police reform is to ensure public safety. And there's a way to do that. And there's things that we can do to reform and improve those things. You already talked about a few, but with police reform, we got to look at police unions. We got to look at how bad cops are protected. We have to also empower law enforcement officers to also root out bad cops or corruption if it exists in their department. And don't get me wrong, Nick, the vast majority of police officers are phenomenal people. They are good, upstanding people who are there for the right reasons and for service. We're only talking about a very, very small few who have co-opted their position and used their power to oppress people. And I think it's important. Look, me as a black man, I don't want to be stereotyped based on a small few. We shouldn't do the same thing with police either. We shouldn't stereotype all of them as bad just because of a few.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting, too, you talk about the police union, and I've also heard talk about decertification. And it was interesting, the first person that approached me to talk about decertification was not an activist. It was not a criminal justice reform attorney. It was a police chief. It was law enforcement saying, look, we understand that in every organization, you're going to have an element that is negligent or bad at their job or even potentially, abusing their powers. And the goal is always to set up barriers to where you can recognize those people before they get into the profession and stop them from ever joining. But then there's also the idea that some people will slip through the cracks. And so you want to make sure that as soon as you can identify someone that is a problem, that is operating outside of the boundaries of their position or the ethics of their position, they need to be removed. And this police chief was basically saying, he goes, Nick, there are times where we have to let someone go because they've been negligent or potentially abusive in their powers. He goes, I really don't have any process for decertifying them. And so they can go, 7 counties away and get
Yep.
another job. And he goes, we want to stop that. We don't want that guy, affecting the image of police officers. We don't want them having an adverse effect on those communities and making it harder to do our job. So I think the decertification is something that we've got a lot of broad spread support on. Another question I want to ask you is about this whole move to defund the police. I think if people had said that, look, we want to reallocate more dollars toward addiction intervention or trauma-informed policing or, medical-informed policing so that when an officer shows up to a situation, they can identify someone that might be dealing with dementia or they might be dealing with a circumstance that, a lot of times someone that is dealing with a really, really, tough case with respect to mental illness, they're not deliberately trying to be physically aggressive. It can be a result of a medical condition and teaching officers in order to better, work with that in order to de-escalate. I think all of us would be in favor of that. But now it's moved into defunding the police. Who do you think is really behind defunding the police? Because I see a lot of these man on the street interviews, and those can be good, those can be bad. But I have a hard time believing that in communities where there is a crime issue, that they want to defund the police. I mean, what's your experience? What's your insight with, as you talk to people, as you research this, who's really behind defunding the police, and is it the communities that would actually be defunded?
No, it's not the communities that would be defunded. I think the vast majority of the American public, we see this in poll after poll, they support the police, although they want to see some reforms. I think this defund the police movement is really coming from a liberal base of individuals and activists that are wanting to stir things up, and they want to push the envelope, and they're wanting to push the Democrats to make bold changes. But I think what they're proposing is really harmful. I think it was really interesting. This week, a poll came out in Gallup that said African Americans overwhelmingly support the presence of police in their communities. They said 61% of black people actually are okay with the police presence that is in their community now, and even 20% wants to see it increased, a total of 81%. And I think that's very, very telling. And as you look across the country right now, over the last, especially 60 days, violence and homicide has been increasing in cities all across America, whether it's New York City or Chicago or Baltimore. And guess where these communities are happening? They're mainly in communities of color, and the overwhelming the victims are black and brown, young people, children. And so I don't know where this defund the police isn't necessarily coming from those communities. And I have to agree with the new Richmond police chief, Gerald Smith, who was just hired. And he said, don't defund the police. He said, we need to fund the change in police. And that means we got to fund training. We got to do new training for police. We have to focus on de-escalation tactics and some of the things that you're talking about. But defunding or abolishing the police is a really bad idea.
Well, it was interesting. I started researching this more. I mean, my father was LAPD, and he was a homicide detective. He worked in some very dangerous areas. I remember him getting called up at 2:00 in the morning. I remember when he retired, there was a family of a victim on a case that he worked that showed up to his retirement and presented him with a ring with the birthstones of the 3 people that had been murdered from this family that my father helped catch the guy and bring him to justice. And that's what we want, is a community policing program. And, Eleanor Ostrom, who's the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Economics, I thought did a great job in talking about some of the problems of the way the government has mismanaged law enforcement. And one of them has been the consolidation movement, which, they started talking about it in the 20s, 30s. They really amped it up in the 60s, 70s. And it was the destruction of a lot of these smaller community-based departments for these larger metropolitan area departments. And the whole idea was, well, it's going to be more efficient. It's going to allow for, sharing of resources. And I think to some degree there's some validity to that. But my overall problem is that, but you lost the connection between the officer and the community.
And the community.
And what are your thoughts on how do we foster better community-oriented policing without that delving into the federal government saying, okay, community policing is important, and now we're going to tell you how to do it. It's like, no, that's not the point. You need the community to tell them how to do it. How do we foster that?
And that's been one of my frustrations. We've had activists in Washington, D.C., and quite frankly, white liberals telling how police should operate in many of these communities. No, the neighborhood should be the one having the conversation with the police chief about what the policing needs to look like and how they can work together in tandem to reduce crime. I tell people oftentimes that in some communities, some low-income communities, the only time they see police is when something is going bad, something's going down, there's a crime, okay? We need to bring police into the community for events. We know there's a national night out that occurs, I believe, in September. It's a great event. We need more of that. We need police officers coming to schools to meet students, to get to know them, to participate, to actually educate them on what their job is like. I want to see a more diverse police apartment as well, or not a department in the communities where all of these urban centers are. And so I want to see young people growing up to say they actually want to see police. I think it's really interesting. Even the NAACP president in Portland criticized the riots and all of the violence that was going on. He was saying that this was supposed to be about Black lives. And he said, now it's about a white spectacle. Because all these people are coming in and talking about all these other issues. They're not talking about George Floyd anymore. They're not talking about Ahmaud Arbery. They're not talking about Breonna Taylor. And you know, their eye is off of the ball, and it's important that we remain very focused. And this, any type of reforms needs to come from the community and local up, not the top down.
No, I remember in Culpeper, Little Culpeper, we had 2 BLM rallies in Culpeper, and people showed up. They were passionate. There was a really good presence. They, they had a march. They had a rally. 2 separate ones. One was a little more kind of spontaneous. One had a little bit more time to organize. And I'll never forget watching. I'm sitting there on Main Street, and I'm watching the protest. And there's one lady who's holding a sign, which I think said "No justice, no peace," looks over and she sees one of the police officers. And she immediately runs over, puts down her sign, gives him a big hug, throws up the phone and asks me to take a picture of him because they knew each other. They'd grown up together. Great. Right. And I'm looking at it going, this right here answers so many of the issues that we're trying to address. It's that intimate knowledge between police officers and the communities that they're serving. And I give so much credit to the people within the community, the department within the community. A lot of our civic organizations, our churches have held these different events with congregations, pastors, civic leaders, and law enforcement to where they are fostering that communication. Because one of the things that I think is so critical is that we do have over-criminalization issues within our legal system. And look, if you've hurt somebody, if you've stolen from somebody, man, you need to be punished, and there needs to be restitution to the victim. And I'm not feeling bad about any of that. But then there's other things where you're looking at going, come on, this is really going to be something that's going to follow, a criminal record's going to follow this guy the rest of their lives. And I see some of the new bills that are coming out, and they're based off of this idea that, well, we're going to get, more intense with the police. And I'm thinking to myself, with the community police where you have that good crosstalk, that's a sort of environment where an officer knows when somebody in the community is really a threat and knows when somebody just needs to be dropped off at their folks' home, right?
Right.
And not tag some kid with a criminal record, early on in life, and now that's they got to carry that. And I feel like we're only going to get those relationships if that communication is coming in, but it's got to be community priorities, not the federal government coming in with some task force, and then all of a sudden all these officers are being pulled off of local issues in order to deal with federal issues because they can get more money from it. So I almost feel like some of this defunding is going to have the opposite effect, because if these departments are looking for revenue sources, well, that means they're going to prioritize those missions which give them that revenue source, and the federal government's going to be more than happy to say, hey, join our task force and here's money for it. No, I want them focused on what that community wants to see done, not what some politician or agency in D.C. wants done.
Yeah, you're exactly right. You guys are about to have a special session in Richmond, right? And I think it's ironic that some of the Democrats are pushing some of the legislation and reforms when he's saying Democrats didn't give due process for our lieutenant governor last year, Justin Fairfax, and some of them were ready to impeach him without even having a trial or looking at evidence. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I want to give a shout out to the outgoing police chief in Prince William County, which is where I live, Barry Bernard. He just retired. And I'll tell you one thing that he did really, really well. And he spent an enormous amount of time in the community with churches, with mosques, with all type of interest groups, community groups, so that they knew him before anything have occurred. And we have a relatively safe community in Prince William County and in Woodbridge, where I live. Yeah, we have issues here and there, but I think one of the reasons why you haven't seen a lot of rioting and violence in Northern Virginia and in Prince William County where I live is because a lot of the people have an open door policy with the police. Mm-hmm. He's the one calling them before there's any issue occurring. And Prince William County is, one of the most diverse counties in the state. It's a majority county, and the police community there has a very, very good relationship with everyone there. So I'm with you, man. It should be bottom up or local up, not top down.
Well, DJ, as we go into special session, obviously we're going to see some good bills. We're going to see some interesting bills, which I always say the word interesting is the most diverse word in political language. It's kind of the polite way of saying interesting or all screwed up. What would you like to see come out of this special session? If there was just a couple things that we could get done, what are some things you'd like to see us do or reform?
Well, one thing, I'd like to see you guys do something on civil asset forfeiture, which is something that you and I have talked about before. But a big piece, I think, is doing something about police unions, making sure there is accountability for police who do something wrong. If you have a police officer like Derek Chauvin who killed George Floyd and is using tactics that is not part of the training, they need to have justice on them too. And so we got to have accountability for police officers. I would like to see more nonviolent diversion programs for nonviolent offenses. And this is no matter who you are in Virginia, whether you're a taxpayer and you're concerned about financial costs, or whether you are an activist on the criminal justice reform side, we should want to see more programs that actually work with many of these individuals who have committed these nonviolent offenses, because we want to reduce recidivism. Mm-hmm. We want to make sure that if someone is committing a crime, that's the last time that they do it. So there needs to be more programming for that. Look, in America, we put more people in prison per capita than any other country, and I think we need to really look at why that is. Yes, we have a lot of freedom, and I'm grateful for that, but I think we sometimes have a heavy hammer sometimes with prison. And so reentry programs are another thing, that when people are coming out of prison, we are helping them to be a responsible citizen. And by the way, the majority of people in prison in Virginia, the majority of them will come back out into our communities. Yeah. So what are we doing now to help prepare them?
No, I think that all makes a lot of sense. And, I remember I showed up to a graduation for people that were incarcerated that had finished basically career technical education training. They were learning a trade. And I'm with you. I think the diversion programs have a great deal of merit, especially for those people that they're not a flight risk. They're not a violence risk. And quite frankly, I want them doing some sort of productive labor that actually helps them do restitution to their victim, not just paying court fines or fees, but restitution to their victims. And I think a diversion program, which actually provides them some training, allows them to engage in that productive labor, pay restitution to their victim, and then sets them up for greater success when they leave that status, I think is definitely a move in the right direction. DJ, as always, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for all of the work that you do, not just on this topic, but on every one. Incredibly intelligent guy, very well read, has put in a lot of time and effort, incredible life story, great family. I just can't say enough good things about you, DJ.
Nick, I need to take you everywhere I go, man, and do my introductions, dude. You're making me feel
good
right
football player, right? Well, hey, DJ, thank you very much for having on, sharing your thoughts.
Your check is in the mail. That was good.
Thanks for your insight, brother. I really appreciate it. DJ Jordan, everyone.